So hi everyone, and welcome to Candler in Conversation, our space for Candler community as well as friends of Candler to participate in conversations about theology, faith, and public life, hosted by the Candler Foundry. My name is Crystal Golden, and I serve as the program coordinator for the Candler Foundry, and I'm also the facilitator of today's conversation. Thank you for watching us here on Facebook Live. If you have any questions during today's conversation, feel free to add them to our video feed and we'll try to answer them here. So for today's conversation, we are talking about what do we say to our white congregation? So the work of becoming actively anti-racist often starts in one's own home, heart, and church. So from congregations newer to the fight for social justice and racial justice, and our congregations that have been engaged in the work for a little while longer, we're starting to realize that there's still so much to learn and to put into practice. And so our invited guests for today will share what they've been saying and what they've been doing within their own congregation. So first we have the Reverend Jenelle Holmes, pastor of Ormwood Church, which is a 3-year-old worshiping community in Southwest Atlanta. Prior to her role as pastor, she served as the director of young adult ministry at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Buckhead. She's a 2015 graduate of Candler and a passionate believer in creativity, courage, and context, which is all perfect for this conversation. Thank you so much, Jenelle, for being here. Next, we have Reverend Will Dyer, the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church of Augusta, Georgia. His role there is to preach, teach, and lead the 3,500 member congregation. He's a 2008 graduate of Candler, and he also earned a D-Min from McAfee School of Theology in 2019, where his work was focused on the need for new theological language for the postmodern world. Thanks for being here, Will. Also joining us as a guest, we have Reverend Melaine Vaughn-West. Melanie received her MDiv from Candler in 2001, and after being ordained, she served as pastor of Broadneck Baptist Church in Maryland from the fall of 2001 to the spring of 2007. She now serves as on the pastoral team at Oakhurst Baptist Church in Decatur, Georgia. Thanks for being here, Melanie. And finally, we have Reverend Suzannah Davis. Upon graduating from Candler in 1995, she was ordained in the United Methodist Church and served churches and agencies in the North Georgia Conference for the following 11 years before receiving a call to start a new church within the United Church of Christ in 2006. She currently serves as a senior minister at Kirkwood United Church of Christ. Thank you, Susannah, for being here. So for additional context, many of our questions for today came from viewers of the Breaking Bread webinar that happened several weeks ago. We wanted to create this space to just talk candidly about what our experiences have been in doing anti-racist work within these churches. And so my first question is, how have you addressed the need to work towards racial justice from your pulpits during worship services?
I'll go ahead because this is the easiest question. Jump in here. I think where we have the ability to create the worship service and to write the sermon, the staff and the leadership at Oakhurst has basically said this is our one issue right now, that we can't really be focused on anything else until we commit to this work in particular for the duration. And so the worship service is designed around having a number of components that are aimed towards being anti-racist. There's always a moment of silence for those killed by white supremacy and racism, where we list recent names, which unfortunately we usually have more of every week. And then I can't think of a sermon in a long time that hasn't been focused around racist work in some way, or addressed it in some way. And then I think looking musically is also important. Looking at people like Melanie who are doing a lot of work with social justice and racism in music and incorporating those elements.
Thank you, Melanie.
I think in our congregation, in many ways, it has become and is certainly becoming now an expectation that we will speak to anti-racist hope and commitment within the worship service. And, you know, sometimes that is heard, well, lately that's always heard in the sermon. Oftentimes it's in the prayers, sometimes in the music that we share. But I think that's an expectation, not just of our pastoral staff and worshiping staff, but certainly of the congregation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Jenelle.
The church I'm serving at right now is probably very similar to Susannah's. That it's somewhat expected, but I have worked in more purple churches in the past. And one of the ways that I have brought in these issues is that we consistently engage current events so that when this is a current event, it is not an affront or confusing while we're talking about it. And so consistently every Sunday, praying for, preaching about, engaging with current events, so that you've already built that bridge into the service and into your sermon where they're going to expect that you're going to talk about important things and they might be hard, but that's what we do.
Yeah, that was it. Teresa Fry Brown I took a preaching class with, who said you prepare your sermon with a New York Times in one hand and a Bible in the other. And so I think for me, I mean, interestingly, Richmond County, where my church is 57% African American, but my congregation is about 92% white. And so there's this huge disparity. And so I think initially my folks thought, well, what are you going to say, if anything at all? And so for me initially, I'll back up and say it's strange to not be preaching to people in a room, but to be preaching in a studio to a camera, which changes the preaching element, as you all would attest to. But for me, it's initially been, guys, Black Lives Matter is not just a social issue, but this is a gospel imperative issue as well. And so it's been having folks recognize that racism, one, is a very, very real thing, even in our own midst. And if we're going to follow Jesus well, the gospel requires us to address these issues. And they've responded beautifully. The number of emails and phone calls, hey, thank you, keep doing what you're doing. It's been really cool.
Yeah. And I do think that there are so many places where people are accessing good anti-racist materials and experiences. But to what Will said, we're one of the places where we get to tie that with theology and faith. And so we kind of have that responsibility on Sunday mornings to say, like, you can read White Fragility, you can go to all these things, but here we're going to talk about it in this specific framework. And so in some sense, it gives you license to then address it, because they can find these things other places, but they really can't find some of that faith engagement, or at least they need to be finding that in the church.
There's a line I've come to rely on in my sermons, and it is, if you don't like what I said, don't get mad at me, get mad at Jesus, right? Because he's the one pressing us forward on this, right? Yeah.
And so then how do you encourage your members to go from what they've heard on Sunday or on Wednesday and to actually move into action? What does that process look like?
For us, we have a group that meets then to try to strategize. It's the racial justice mission group, although we're talking about changing the name to anti-racism mission group. And then they gather and do the planning, the strategizing kind of work. And it does have two components. So there's so that group gathers once every 2 weeks to look at either report on action and invite others to actions they are aware of, and then also strategize ahead. That group has decided to align themselves as closely as they can with the Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights, and we have the leader of that group is also in the Beacon Hill Alliance, in order to follow the leadership of Black leaders in our community. It does have a reflective component as well. So there is the meeting that happens outside that meeting once a week, where people gather to try to uncover and get in touch with our own racism and do the reflective work for that.
For me, this is an interesting question, because how do I encourage my congregants to cease intellectualizing? This is more of an interior journey for myself before, so I'm kind of going with them along the path. So the first thing, I reached out to some friends, former Candler students and alum who are pastors of Black churches in our city, and said, man, what do I need to do? Help me along the road. And it was funny, Charles Goodman, who is at Tabernacle, which is the largest church in our city, he said, Will, the first step is to develop empathy, to try and recognize that you've never been in my shoes, but what does it feel like to be in that position? And so I went, and again, it is intellectualizing what I'm about to say, but I picked up Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. Oh my word. I mean, it's gut wrenching to read that. And it was a moment of, oh my God. I mean, as a guy who, I didn't go to school with a Black person until I went to college. This is mind-blowing stuff for me. And so it's been a personal transformation before I can get to that moment of helping my congregation grapple with it. I'm journeying with them in that. So it's been neat.
Are we on the second question now? Is that what
you can answer either question?
Well, I only say that because I was like, I don't actually like this question, because I think it divides that distinction, in the intellect, or whatever that word is. I'm not looking at the things now. The interior work is not as important as the exterior work. At least that's the way I read the question, which might not be how it was meant at all. And for me, we've worked a lot with Iyabo Onipede, who is also a Candler grad, and just realizing how much of our work is interior. Before we go exterior and mess up more stuff, we've got to do the interior work of, building the empathy, learning the structures, learning appropriate vocabulary. So for me, I would not have a dichotomy of we need to stop thinking about this and go out and just do it. That to me actually seems pretty dangerous, because a lot of the people in my congregation and myself have a lot of interior work to do in order to make that exterior work beneficial, equitable, not awkward, or even more burden for our Black brothers and sisters. So I think it's dangerous to see it in that dichotomy of inner and outer work and saying one is better than the other. I think they both, there's that. If you want to go white, Richard Rohr, contemplation and action, right? You got to do both. And I would hate to disparage one for the other. I'm also Presbyterian, and we love to be in our minds. So I'm like, hey, I'm offended by that question.
Thanks for naming that, Jenelle. And I think the original intent from the question came from a person feeling like people just turn to books, didn't do anything else besides read a book or watch a film.
Or read memes even. Your Instagram account is not a well-written book by someone living the experience. It's your Instagram account. Right. So yeah, I think there are a lot of probably distinctions that could be made in that question.
One thing that, I'll let Susannah go first, and then I have something else to say.
Well, there was an article moving around Facebook I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago at this point, I guess, when Black people are hurting, white people join book clubs. And I think there's just a tremendous amount of truth in that. And about 6 years ago, we hired our first associate pastor of the church, Charmaine Penn Johnson, who is a 2012 graduate of Candler, who is also a person of color. And I think we felt proud of ourselves for having a person of color on staff and saying, yes, we want to be more racially integrated. We want to reflect our community more. But put a lot of that responsibility on Charmaine in doing all of the things that we shouldn't have done. Yet Charmaine is a powerhouse, and none of us could imagine our congregation without her. But we also began to realize these are not conversations that we expect Charmaine to hold and carry and have. And so about a year ago, we began a new ministry called Table Talk. And for 4 months, we met once a month as an entire congregation. The expectation was that everyone would participate in our table talks. And we had some folks come in and talk with us and share with us, and then would move to smaller conversations around our table, all around racial issues, all around racial bias, all around how to commit ourselves to be anti-racist, although even a year ago, that was not the language that we used. Mm-hmm. But it certainly opened up a space for us to begin to practice conversations, not just intellectualizing them, I would say, but with our head and with our heart, but that inward work, to practice that inward work with one another so that we could feel more confident in the outward action that has to happen in the world. And I'm so thankful that we've had some underpinning and foundation in that way. So about 2 weeks ago, I guess, we had our first Table Talk round 2, and it really was a time for us to check in with one another. And all of the questions were internal, inviting people into that internal part of themselves to respond. How are you doing? How are you responding to others? How are you recognizing your personal commitment? You know, we've heard this several times, but it's a helpful way to talk about it, for this not to be a moment, but a movement within yourself. And we're really clear that that work has to be essential before we can just sort of go out into the world like we have all the answers and all the action and all of that figured out. And it has to be action and reflection at some point. There's no doubt about that. But that internalized work that we're sharing gives us hope for what can happen as we move into action.
There's that, I know most people probably have read it, although I'll post it in the chat as well, the white supremacy culture document that talks about the characteristics of white supremacy culture, which, you know, you read that and you're like, oh my, you know, that we are all of this, we are all these things, and we've all said we're going to commit to reading it, you know, at least once a week. But you know, one of the things about white supremacy culture that we keep reminding ourselves is that urgency, like, you know, like both Jenelle and Susannah are talking about, like, we'll just go out and do something because we have to do it right this second, and that being a product of white supremacy culture. And then the other thing I was thinking about in this question is also the body aspect. We've talked about the heart and the mind, but our minister of music, Karen Shipp, was sending me today to the Kimberly Jones video on YouTube, Why We Can't Win, and I'll post that if people haven't seen it. But the leader of Karen's group was saying you have to listen to this with your whole body. you can't just listen with your heart. You can't just listen with your mind. And that, I think, is also a product of white supremacy culture, to, you know, to stay in those two places, but not like take it in our bodies, because our bodies have been, a lot of our bodies have been safe and protected, and it's hard to open our bodies up to that too.
Yeah. Jenelle, you mentioned people posting on Instagram as part of their way of, I guess, getting involved or saying something. But this question is related to that in terms of how do we move from performatory allyship to actually being true co-conspirators in the fight for racial justice?
Yeah, I think in the middle of a pandemic, that is gonna be real hard. And I'm sure all of y'all have lots of things to say about this. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about recently comes from a parishioner of ours, Courtney. And so she has been, and she serves on our team that does a lot of this stuff. She talks a lot about practice before you preach. So if you haven't done it, don't post it on Instagram. If you haven't called the senator, don't tell other people to do it. And so she has really helped us understand that you got to practice it before you're allowed to talk about it. And so that has been helpful for me, just in what I post and kind of that moment of like, is this performative? Is this not? And it's like, well, I did it. I'd love other people to do it. I will post it. So that's one of the things that we've talked about recently. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else can answer this question as well.
We've tried to talk, and I it's easy for me to lead this conversation because it's so true about, I worry about my inadequacy to respond at times. That I'm going to say the wrong thing, that I'm not going to say enough, that I'm going to worry about how other people may hear what I say. But giving myself grace to and getting my ego out of the way to say and risk what needs to be said and risked in that moment, and knowing that what I offer might just be an example for somebody else, and recognizing how many other people have been an example and a witness to me in the courage to speak out or post or whatever that is, and the courage to really pay attention in those times of action to what I am feeling internally, and to try to be honest about that as well. We, in this pandemic time, we recognize that a lot of folks are needing to stay at home and stay safe, and we want to honor that as much as possible. Yet we want to get our feet moving, and we want to proclaim Black Lives Matter and the truth of that as loud as we can. So we planned a prayer march just in Kirkwood. It wasn't it wasn't throughout the city, but just in Kirkwood. And I thought maybe we'd have 20, 25 people show up. We had about 65 people show up. You had to wear your mask. You had to stay socially distant from one another, and everyone wore their mask. We did a sort of a lousy job at the beginning of staying apart because we've been apart for so long, but then that opportunity to move through our community that we love and to proclaim a truth that we believe in and are learning to believe in, some of us, I would say, felt like worship, and it felt like liturgy, and it felt like the presence of God, and it was curious afterward that there was rejoicing, but not in such a way that we needed to tell everybody just exactly what we just did, but in a way that I think moved us in our whole body. Melanie, coming back around to that, and that there's that bodily witness that was powerful in our community and powerful for each one of us too, I think. And we've just got to keep figuring this out. How to, if you hadn't done it, don't preach about it. I appreciate that. I get that. Yeah.
Courtney Greathouse. She's great.
Got it. Thanks.
Another thing I did want to lift up that I think is applicable to at least this part of the conversation. In Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson talks a lot about proximity. A lot. And I think part of the way to actually engage is it increase or decrease your proximity? You want to get closer. And so making your proximity to these issues, proximity to Black people in your life, to African-American religious culture, all of these things, bringing the proximity closer, I think makes it so you can't be performative. You're engaging in it. You're not just talking about it. I'm not that great at it. So I say this not as someone who does it well, but as someone who knows I need to do better at that. But that the whole idea to push away from just performance, like the proximity is really crucial. And I do think that, like Will was talking about reading the book and developing empathy, I do think, I grew up in a place that in Eastern Washington State, there's not a lot of Black people. So for me, a lot of that empathy was through books and through film and things like that. So I do think that those do have a place, but I also think we're in Georgia. Like there's really no excuse to not have proximity.
So talking about proximity, there is an elementary school about 2 miles down the road, Copeland Elementary School, and it's 96% Black. And no one from our church goes to Copeland Elementary School. There's another elementary school that's 3.5 miles down the road from our church, Lake Forest, and my kids go there, and a number of other kids go there as well from our church. And I'm proud of our people, because prior to my arrival, they had been really strategic about developing an intentional relationship with Copeland. And so we've got 30 people that go in, and their sole initiative is to hang out with those children and read books and just be present with them on a Monday through Friday. And it was neat for me the first time I did it, just to go sit down. And we're not reading religious books. I mean, I'm reading the books I read to my children at night. Whatever it is, I'm blanking on whatever books they're reading right now, Ninjago or whatever. But it was a moment for me of, oh my God, these kids are my kids. And there's a proximity to it that's beautiful. And it reminded me of N.T. Wright said, the kingdom arrives not through the statement of bishops and preachers, but through the work of ordinary people just going in and doing the work. And that's, when I look at those 30, 40 members of my church, that a lot of them are retired moms and dads who got a little extra time on their hands, and they're just going in and loving on these kids and being present. And it's, any good that comes out of that is just as much for those people that read as for the children who listen. Which segues kind of in the next question. Sorry to jump ahead.
No, you are more than welcome to, Will. And I was actually going to throw this question to your way to begin with. So how do you engage with local pastors and churches, or do you engage with people in your proximity who may be satisfied with the status quo and don't feel as if they need to do any work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So again, to reference Charles Goodman at Tabernacle, he and I have become friends over the course of a few months. And the first thing I did was I called Charles, and we just so happened to both be golfers. And so I said, Charles, let's go play golf and just talk for a little while and figure out, is there anything we can do together? And what was fascinating, and Charles would be comfortable with me talking about it, at the end of our round, 4 hours together on a golf course. And he said, Will, I can't thank you enough for this not being a photo op, an opportunity for us just to get, he said, the number of people that call me simply because they want a photo op. And I'm committed to that not being the case. So that is a moment for me of, okay, how do we build intentional partnerships that we can do big things in our city? I mean, you think if my church and Charles's church do something together that's sustainable over a long term, that's literally thousands of people paying witness to the kingdom of God and racial equality in our city that is completely split racially. I think Susannah could speak to that, being close to Augusta for a certain point in her life. But yeah, for me, it's just little steps like that.
I will say that engaging other pastors who seem satisfied with the status quo, I don't know that I have a lot of other pastors in my life who are okay. Close friends who are okay with the status quo. But I do consider myself a part of a community where I grew up, and I love a whole lot that many of those folks are okay with the status quo. And I feel like some of my pastoral work, and I hope some of my prophetic work happens in those small towns with maybe lay people and their pastors who are okay with the status quo. And it feels like important work, but it also feels like scary work and really hard work. Even conversations with friends that I love dearly and family members from that small town. It has been crucial to have hard conversations and to feel a lot of anger and frustration, and to come back around to love over and over again, and to come back around to the revolutionary work of Jesus and the gospel that, as Will said earlier, calls us to this work without being a total pain in the neck.
Yeah.
I wrote some notes when we talked, and on number 5, I wrote, not really. And I think it's just the way the question is phrased. Like, I think a lot of us, especially women, have learned to make smaller communities of supportive people. And so my small community is pretty supportive and, all of that. So not really, but I felt like the next question kind of got at something in a similar way. What are your tips for newer church leaders that find themselves in more conservative environments? Because I think that's kind of the same question. It's just colleagues versus congregants. Mm-hmm. And one thing I learned from a retired pastor a while ago is, and this is just pastoral care 101 or 101, is relationships. Like, if you're not doing the pastoral care, if you're not putting the time in to get to know these people, like that is your entry to them, is you have to have a relationship with them. And I have found that people are willing to stay at the table if they trust the host and if they have a relationship with the host. Even if the conversation's uncomfortable, they're willing to stay at the table if they trust and they know you. If they don't, they're gonna walk away. And so if you want to have any sort of prophetic anything, you've got and it's just time. It is just a lot of time. And it's time not talking about anti-racism. It's time talking about their cat, like all these things. It's time doing their family members' funerals. It's, until you put in that time, that you do, they're not going to stay at the table as long.
And Jenelle, I agree with you completely. I would add on to that, even some of those people that have been at the table with you for a number of years, when you have that conversation, they're going to get up and leave. And that is going to break your heart, but it's going to happen, and it's okay. That's important to know. I mean, especially for newer newer church leaders that are in more conservative environments. I mean, it happens, but that doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing. That's part of the way of the cross, I think.
Yeah, and there's a difference of allowing someone else to go versus my leaving. There's a real importance to model staying engaged. Staying engaged. That we had between these two questions, the question that keeps coming up for us, and Susannah was talking about it a lot, but it's family members. So like when we had our reflection time after worship 2 Sundays ago, on our Zoom call, it was all about the struggles that congregation members are having with extended family. And and it's not that any of those folks aren't having the conversations, but it's the kind of, for how many decades do I have to have the same conversation over and over and over again and not feel hopeless, not feel despair in that. And we had somebody from Compassion in Atlanta come to our church and Leanne Rubenstein lead a conversation about hard conversations with those closest to you, and they're the most painful often, because we have the most disappointment of those people that are closest to us, I think. And so that's been something that we've been processing a lot, that I have no answers for, except for that we support one another in staying engaged in those conversations.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead, Jenelle.
Are you sure?
Yeah, please.
You let me go last time though. Mine is linked to Melanie's and what Will said earlier about people will walk away from the table. I had not a great experience about 6 or 7 years ago with a church that basically asked us and a few other congregants to walk away from the table because we wanted to talk about this. And it was not pretty, and it was very hurtful. And now, despite 6 or 7 years, because it was right after Ferguson, so 6 or 7 years later, I'm still friends with some of them on Facebook. And they're different people. They're posting Black Lives Matter stuff. They're, people who 6 or 7 years ago, I was like, I can't even with you. Have changed. And so realizing just because they walk away from your table doesn't mean they're not going to find one. Or like the sovereignty of God, like God can do amazing things. It might not be with me. I might be the one person to push them far enough that they're storming off to do some sort of transformation. Because there are quite a few people from that congregation that I can look at now and say, you were in a totally different place 5, 6, 7 years ago. And now, through whatever work they've done, they're doing better. And so just realizing, like, it's not, I think that we assume that when we get in an argument and somebody walks away upset, that's the end and they're never going to change. And I think oftentimes that upsetting argument is the seed for transformation. But if you made them upset, you're not going to be the one to see it. Like, you're just not. I think it can happen, but you just have to trust that it's gonna happen, just maybe not with you.
Yeah, what I was gonna say is in my context now, I don't get as much opportunity to have those sit at the table conversations and tell me about your cat and your family. But from a preaching perspective, and I would probably think my context might be the most conservative on our panel today. What I have found is, and I mentioned it earlier, as long as if I keep focused on Jesus and I stay there, what's been shocking to me in 3 years, the number of people that have said to me, Will, I can't believe how much you talk about Jesus. Now, I didn't become a Christian until I was 24 years old. So I'm kind of like, what else am I supposed to do? I thought that was the point, because really, when you actually read the Gospels, this dude is revolutionary. And if we stay on that in an evangelical context or a conservative context, light years, man. I mean, for a good example of somebody from doing race work perspective, that in Southern Baptist life, which our church is duly aligned, but Russell Moore, who, you might not agree with him on everything, but head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, is doing great stuff, pushing boundaries with racial reconciliation. And it is because he stays focused on Jesus. So to our conservative pastors out there, just stick with Jesus. And
some of your progressive pastors out there.
Yeah. How about that?
You hear that too sometimes.
Yeah. I have moments of feeling like we are trying to say something new because we need to say something new. And so much, everything of what we need to say is in those Gospels. I do believe that. And just thinking about too, as we've been talking about relationships with people and how important that is, period, but certainly how important that is right now. We need to push for justice. We need that to be our priority. I think it must be our priority right now, but we cannot forget mercy in the middle of that push too. And Brian Stevenson, in his book and in his address that he gave at Emory too, he just does a beautiful job of not offering people a way out, or even away from the table necessarily, knowing that mercy can always be a part of this conversation. And he means that, I think he shares that and shows that in a lot of different ways, but we have received mercy. What does it mean for us to share that with one another too? Grace, mercy, whatever.
Mm-hmm. We just got a question from Facebook, and it's from Will's last comments. So someone is wondering if you all might comment on the idea that preaching about racial justice is political or perceived as such.
I have worried about that in the past. I am not worried about that anymore. I have made a real shift about that. And I know that congregants have been worried about that in the past, and some still are, but I think there's been a shift in the congregation as well.
I think we all, we are using different language in our different contexts. Obviously, Will would use a different language and different approach than I would in my context. But I was fortunate enough to be at Candler when Archbishop Desmond Tutu was there, who said, Christianity is political, or it's not Christianity. I mean, Jesus was, Jesus, as Will was saying, was a radical socialist, who wanted to tear down all of the systems of oppression that were hurting people, and liberate people from that. And so I can say that in my context. I can call Jesus a socialist without anybody batting an eye. I'm probably Will might not be able to, but he's still going to say the same thing.
When you said that, I thought, how am I going to respond when any of my church members watching this just
sorry Will. but I mean, it's code switching in some sense, but Jesus was a very radical figure who did not come to show us, in my theological perspective, show us the way to a sweet by and by where everything's going to be okay, but to bring about an upside down kingdom and create heaven on earth.
Yeah, I think, going a few comments. I think what Melanie said is right on. If the gospel isn't political, then it's not the gospel. I think the way of Jesus necessarily infringes upon our public life and our personal lives as well. And so for me, it's not something I think about. I definitely get a couple of emails almost weekly that are, hey, I don't like when you talk about politics. And I respond and I say, well, I'm not. Or maybe I'm not in the way you think I am. What happens in my context is people immediately try to put me in a camp. You know, they'll either go, okay, oh, you're a Democrat or you're a Republican. To which I'm pretty quick to go, yeah, I'm disgusted with both, man. There's got to be a third way. And so that's how it manifests itself in my context is, oh, well, you must be this or you must be that. And so to resist the one of my greatest goals is to never let someone figure out, politically, oh, you must be this. Because I think Jesus offers a different way forward than those dichotomies of our age. So in racial issues, that tends to manifest itself as, oh, Will, you must be a Democrat. No. Back up. Let's talk about Jesus again. Yeah.
It's also really important to do vocabulary work. Yes. For yourself and for your congregation. So if you haven't figured out what the word political means for yourself, you're going to be tongue-tied when somebody brings that question to you. And so knowing what you think the word political means, where you've seen it come up in your context or where you've seen it come up in the Bible. And so doing work on, okay, if somebody says this to me, I know what that word means. I need to find out what they mean by that word. So then you're not going in it in this panic of like, am I political? I don't know. But you've done the vocabulary work for yourself. And also it sounds like a great sermon to talk about like, what does political mean? I mean, politics is the way we organize ourselves. Like literally that's what it is. It's the way we organize ourselves. And so I hope God has something to say about that.
Yeah, come on.
And I hope that we can talk about it at church, because if we can't, then what are we doing?
N.T. Wright's been really helpful for me, and he's Anglican, so of course he's cool with it. But as a Baptist, we tend to just draw those false dichotomies. Oh, spiritual and grounded, but that's a false dichotomy. So I've appreciated his work.
I have another question, and it kind of backtracks us a little bit from the order in which I asked earlier. But knowing that we're not all experts here, but have engaged in some practice, how do you amplify Black voices without overburdening them in this work?
This is the hard, there's a lot of hard questions in this conversation, but how do I, on one hand, follow Black leadership, want to look to Black leadership and follow that, and like we keep talking about, not saying like, tell me, a white person who created racism, how to fix racism. Help me fix racism. What do you want me to do? What am I supposed to be doing? And overburden. And I am so kind of constantly in that. What does that look like? And I don't know. One, it is the proximity and putting myself close to Black leadership and looking to them. But also not trying to figure out how I'm not asking them to do the work for me or tell me what work I need to do. It's hard.
The people of color in our church are, several folks are serving in leadership roles right this minute. And I think we have been, or I'll say I have been, wanting to listen to what they are willing to share and to say. And again, I think Charmaine is a person of wisdom in all manner of ways, but I think she is willing to lead our congregation when she feels called to do so. And I hope that we are not putting pressure on her to do that when she doesn't feel called to do so, and following when she does. I think it's important for people of color to, in our congregation, again, I'm thinking specifically to have space to say what they need to say, especially right now, and for us to be quiet and listen. And that's not to say that I haven't called our co-moderator and said, help me. I need you to help me right now. And I know I'm not supposed to ask you to help me right now, but I need you to help me. Can you? Will you? Well, yeah, of course. But she's been doing that as long as she's been a co-moderator, because I always need her help in many different areas. But one of the places that I have really paid attention to that amplified voice right now of people of color is in our denomination. Within the United Church of Christ, have been offering, really since we have been quarantined, these amazing Zoom offerings several times a week, and with some amazing voices that are just sharing, preaching, teaching, and really trying to make space to listen to those folks speak and to try and learn something and gain some wisdom in that way. And I'll just say I'm specifically thinking of Tracy Blackman, who's our justice and witness person in the UCC, and Bishop Yvette Flunder, who is a church leader in the United Church of Christ in San Francisco, and trying to listen and hear and pay attention.
I think in a day, like a week in, week out Sunday type of atmosphere, I mean, you could make changes in which people you consult during sermon writing. So for example, we did Acts about a year ago, and I used Willie Jennings' commentary. And so I think that you as a pastor, especially if you're at a large church and preaching really is your access point, making sure that the people you're reading, the commentaries you're reading, the resources you're using are from people of color, doing a deep dive in womanist theology, things like that, so that you're not just quoting people, but you're starting to take in some of those frameworks that inform you. And so then when you do go to scripture, you know what questions to ask. And they're not all white questions. But for sermon writing in particular, making sure that your resources are diverse, I think is an easy way to just start that immediately.
And one other just step to do, and this is part of our culture at Oakhurst, and I realize it might not be as much other places, just get out. I can get out of the pulpit. I mean, I'm not expected to preach every Sunday. So I have a number of people who are ordained at Oakhurst, who are Candler grads, who are Black, who can come and preach. Or now with Zoom, even though they live around the world, it's been a lot easier to invite those folks back to preach. Although I will say the other night I had a dream. There's three ministers on staff. There's two pastors and a minister of music. And in my dream, all of a sudden it occurred to me that we were all white, and I was horrified. Like that was my in the dream I was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? We're all white. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a bigger question for our church. But we need to have, if we don't have those voices in our church, we have those connections to say, come preach here, come lead us.
Yeah, it's interesting, Melanie. I was having I think recognizing there's an issue, right? I was having a conversation with my wife. My wife's a dentist, and we're just talking about who we interact with during the course of our days. And she said, Will, the fact that I interact with a more diverse group of people in my dental office than you do in your church means there's a problem. Oh my word. Like if that one didn't just like go right there and it's immediate. Okay, first step, recognize there's a problem. Now what do we do about it? Yeah. Oh my goodness. That one got me. That was a few weeks ago. I thought, oh Sarah, why you gotta come on? Like,
that is so we are an almost 100% white congregation. And it is not, and we're new, and every year it's like, what is happening? I mean, part of that we're a parish church basically, and we reflect a white neighborhood. But that does not matter. And so that's something that this is the whitest church I've ever gone to. And I started it. And so trying to figure that out, it is not easy. A lot of it is we do things in a white way. We are Presbyterian. And so the order of worship, all of these things. And we're actually pretty creative and all of this, but it's still, yeah, we're white. This is just ongoing struggle. It is even hard for us to get interns of color because they walk in and they're like, yeah, I don't think so. And I'm like, don't blame you. Yeah, it's hard. It is hard. Churches are hard.
And to gather folks in an authentic way. Yeah, so that your worship is authentic and represents the community that's there and the community you hope to be there. And I certainly understand that struggle. And it is something that we work on a lot.
Well, Melanie, Jenelle, Will, Susannah, thank you all so much for being here with us and engaging in some discussion around what you are all doing within your own church spaces. For those of you who are watching us live, thank you for being here as well. If you'd like to learn more about the Candler Foundry or watch the replay of this video, you can do so by visiting this Facebook page, or you can check out our website, candlerfoundry.emory.edu. Our next Candler in Conversation will be Wednesday, July 22nd, and we'll be discussing the question of what does lament have to do with our public witness? So stay tuned. See you guys next time.